It was the kind of Tuesday that felt like it had no edges. I'd been home all morning, moving slowly through the rooms the way I do now, not from illness, just from the particular unhurried pace that comes when you finally stop measuring your days by how much you can produce. I was 64. I had earned slow mornings. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my second cup of coffee, watching the birds on the feeder my husband had installed in the yard the summer before he passed. The big ceramic one with the chipped rim. I'd never replaced it. Some things you leave exactly where someone you loved put them. My daughter and my son-in-law had been living with me for 11 months. They'd moved in after my son-in-law's company downsized, and they lost their apartment lease in the same 60-day window. My daughter had called crying from a parking lot outside a storage facility, and I hadn't even let her finish the sentence before I said, "Of course, come home." "It's your home too." That morning, I could hear my son-in-law on the phone upstairs. His voice carried, the way voices do in old houses with thin ceilings. I wasn't trying to listen. I was thinking about whether I wanted toast, and whether the Finches had come back yet from wherever they go in July. I was thinking about absolutely nothing important. Then I heard my name. Not my name, exactly. I heard what he called me. He said, "The old woman downstairs." And then he laughed at something the person on the other end said. "I set down my coffee cup. She won't last in that house alone," he said. "Claire knows that. We've already started talking about what makes sense long term." A pause. "Look, the house is paid off. No mortgage. And the way property values have moved in this county, we're talking close to 900,000, maybe more." Another pause. "Claire's the only child. It's not complicated. We just need to get her name on the deed before the old woman gets any ideas about selling or giving it away. Once we're on paper, everything else falls into place." He laughed again, low, easy, like he was talking about a chess move. Not a person, not me. "She's lonely. She's grateful we're here. That's the setup. We just have to be patient." I sat very still. The coffee had gone warm. Outside, a single house finch landed on the feeder and sat there looking sideways at nothing. I didn't move for a long time. The house had been ours, mine and my husband's, for 26 years. We'd bought it the year our daughter started middle school, stretching further than we probably should have because he believed in buying something worth keeping. He was a man who thought in decades. He planted oak trees knowing he'd be old before they gave real shade. He painted the porch himself 3 times over the years, each time a slightly different shade of cream, debating with himself out loud about what looked right against the brick. He died 9 years ago. A stroke, fast, while he was driving home from the hardware store. They said he likely didn't feel much. I've held on to that. I've had to hold on to that. After he was gone, I stayed. Of course I stayed. Some people told me a big house was too much for one woman, but they were wrong. It wasn't too much. It was exactly right. Every room had something of him in it. Every drawer, every loose floorboard, every mark on the doorframe where we'd measured our daughter's height each birthday until she declared herself too old for it. The house wasn't empty. It was full of a life we'd built together, and I was still living inside it. I went back to nursing for 4 more years after he died. Then my knees began to make their opinion known, and I retired with a modest pension and what we'd saved and what he'd left. I wasn't rich. I was stable, carefully, the way you learn to be when you've spent 30 years making a single income work for 3 people. My daughter grew up fine. She did. She was a good student, a little scattered, warm-hearted in the way that sometimes makes people easy to take advantage of. She met my son-in-law her 2nd year of graduate school. He was confident in that way that photographs well quick, with a compliment, good at handshakes, the kind of man who makes a strong first impression and then slowly reveals himself to be something more complicated underneath. I saw it from early on. I said nothing, because what mother wants to be that mother? They got married on a September afternoon in our backyard. My husband had been gone 2 years by then, and I spent most of the ceremony thinking about how much he would have liked the weather. For a while, things were fine. They lived a few hours away and visited on holidays. My son-in-law called me by my first name, which I'd told him was fine, even though somewhere quiet in me, it wasn't. My daughter called every Sunday, reliable as rainfall. We were close in the specific way, mothers and daughters who are careful with each other, are close, loving, but with a few rooms we didn't enter. Then came the layoff, then the apartment, then my daughter's voice in a parking lot, and me saying, "Come home," and that being the beginning of the thing I didn't yet understand. I had agreed to. The first months were easy enough to misread as love. My son-in-law fixed the gutter that had been sagging since spring. My daughter cooked dinners 3 nights a week and left the kitchen cleaner than she found it. I told myself this was what family looked like when it was working. I told myself I was lucky to have company in the house. It started small, the way these things always do, which is why you don't see them until they've already accumulated into something heavy. My son-in-law began handling the utility accounts. It was his idea. Framed as helpfulness, he was home during the day since the job search was taking time, and he could manage the calls and the billing cycles. I said, "Thank you." Weeks later, I noticed the electric company was sending confirmation emails to his address. I mentioned it, and he said he'd fix it. He didn't. My daughter repainted the guest bathroom without asking. Soft terracotta, which was pretty, but which covered the pale yellow I had chosen myself at a paint counter on a Saturday, with my husband standing beside me arguing cheerfully for green. I stood in the doorway and breathed through it, and told her it looked lovely. They began referring to the house as ours. At first I thought I was being uncharitable, picking at language, but it was consistent, and it was deliberate. Even if unconsciously so, we should do something about the driveway, and we've been thinking about updating the kitchen and our neighborhood. All of it said in front of me as though I were a tenant in a place that had been transferred already in some private ledger I hadn't signed. One evening, my son-in-law sat down across from me at the dinner table with his laptop open, and he mentioned casually, as though commenting on the weather, that it would make financial sense for my daughter to be listed on the deed. For estate planning purposes, he said, to avoid probate. He used several words that sounded responsible and forward-thinking, and then he smiled the way he always smiled, and said he could have a lawyer friend look it over at no charge. I said I'd think about it. I lay awake that night, listening to the house breathe around me. The particular creak of the hallway when the temperature dropped. The way the bedroom window rattled slightly when wind came from the north. My husband had meant to fix that rattle and never got to it, and I had never fixed it either, because I didn't want to. That rattle was part of something I wasn't ready to smooth away. I thought about the deed. I thought about my son-in-law's voice upstairs that morning, low and easy, like a man who had done the math and liked the answer. And I thought about my daughter. My daughter who had called from that parking lot crying. My daughter who had grown up in this house, who knew where everything was, who used to fall asleep on the couch in the living room during thunderstorms when she was small, because she said the sound of rain on this particular roof made her feel safe. Had she known what he was planning? Was she part of it? Or was she the other version, the one being guided without fully knowing where she was being taken? I wasn't sure which answer was worse. I didn't sleep. But somewhere in the long dark of that night, something in me made a decision. Not a dramatic one. Not anger. Exactly. More like the quiet click of a lock turning. In the morning, I called my accountant, a woman I had worked with for 15 years, someone who knew every corner of my finances and who had the particular quality I needed most right then. She did not flinch. I told her what I'd heard. I told her about the deed conversation. I told her I needed to understand exactly where I stood. She listened. Then she said, "You stand on solid ground. Nothing has been transferred. Nothing has been changed. Everything is yours, and only yours." I said I needed it to stay that way. Over the next 3 weeks, I moved carefully and without announcement. I met with my attorney, a man I'd used twice before, once for my husband's estate and once for a property dispute on the back fence line that had been resolved with a neighborly firmness. He confirmed what my accountant had said. He also outlined, with the particular directness I had come to appreciate about him, exactly what I could do, and exactly what protections I could put in place. I called a realtor I had heard about from a woman in my former nursing cohort, discreet, well-regarded, known for handling sensitive sales without fanfare. I told her I wanted to list the house. I told her I needed to move relatively quickly, and I didn't want a sign in the yard. She said she had 3 buyers who had been waiting for something in this neighborhood. I began to sort through what was mine and what was simply here: my furniture, my books, my photograph albums, my husband's tools in the garage that I would never use but would never give to strangers, the things my daughter and son-in-law had brought, their boxes, their furniture, their accumulated presents in 4 rooms of my house. I left exactly where they were. They could manage that themselves. I made arrangements with a woman from my church who had a spare room and an extra driveway. She'd been my friend for 30 years. I told her the situation in broad strokes, and she said nothing except, "You're not moving into one room. You're moving into your next chapter." She had a way of saying things that landed right, I thought, every day, about whether to tell my daughter first. I picked up the phone a dozen times. I put it down a dozen times. What would I say? That I'd heard her husband planning to inherit my home while I was still living in it? That I'd heard the word patient used like a hunting strategy? That I wasn't angry at her, exactly, but that I also wasn't certain she hadn't known? I couldn't have that conversation without evidence. And once I had evidence, the conversation would already have started without me saying a word. The sale took 8 days from listing to accepted offer. My realtor had not been exaggerating. I spent my last night in the house alone. My daughter and son-in-law had gone to visit his parents for the long weekend, which had, I'll admit, factored into my timing. I walked through every room in the dark with the lights off, just feeling the shape of the place around me. The kitchen where I'd taught my daughter to make pie crust when she was 9. The hallway where I'd measured her height, year by year. In pencil marks she'd been embarrassed about as a teenager, but which were still there under 2 coats of paint. My bedroom, which looked out over the backyard and the oak tree my husband had planted the year we moved in, which was now tall enough to give real shade. I stood at that window for a long time. Then I went to the kitchen table, and I wrote 2 things. The first was a short note for anyone who walked in through the door. I kept it simple. I kept it true. I left it on the counter, weighted down, with my spare key. The second was a letter to my daughter. Long, careful, honest. Not the angry version. I'd already written that in my head at 2 in the morning for several nights running and burned through it. This was the true version. The one that told her about the bird feeder and the pencil marks on the wall and the window that rattled and everything her father had meant when he planted that oak tree. The one that told her I had heard what my son-in-law said and that I needed her to sit with what that meant for who he was and who she was becoming. The one that said I loved her specifically and without condition, and that loving someone and staying in a place where you are being quietly dismantled were not the same thing. The one that ended with, "I hope you'll call me. I'll answer." I mailed it from the post office on my way out of town. They came back on a Friday afternoon. I knew they had arrived because my daughter called 17 times between 4 and 6 p.m. I watched the calls come in from my new bedroom at my friend's house, sitting in a chair by the window with afternoon light coming through the curtains and a cup of tea that was still hot. My son-in-law's calls were shorter and harsher and eventually stopped. My daughter's calls didn't stop. They changed tone. The first ones sounded confused, then alarmed, then something that might have been grief or might have been panic. The 2 can sound similar when you're listening through a phone screen. I listened to the voicemails in order. My daughter's voice in the 4th one. "Mom, please. Where are you? The house is empty. There's a note that says, it says the house was sold. I don't understand. Please just tell me you're okay. Please just call." Her voice in the 7th one. "I found your letter. I'm outside. I'm sitting in the car. Derek went to a hotel. Mom, I've been sitting here for 2 hours. I don't know what to do with what you wrote." I called her back after the 8th voicemail. She answered before the first ring had finished. I let her talk for a while. She cried. She asked questions I didn't answer right away. She said she hadn't known that she knew he had talked about the deed, but she hadn't known how far his thinking had gone. Hadn't known about the phone call upstairs. Hadn't known about the math he'd done on the back of my loneliness. I believed parts of it. I believed she was telling me the version of the truth she had been living inside, which might not have been the whole truth, but was genuinely the only truth she had. I said, I know. She asked if she could come see me. I said not yet. I said I needed her to do something first. I said I needed her to read the letter again, slowly, and then sit with it for 2 weeks, and then call me, and we'd decide what came next together. She did. She called exactly 14 days later on a Sunday morning, which she had always known was my preferred time for important conversations. That choice alone told me something. She said, I left him. I didn't say I was glad, because I wasn't sure yet what I was. I said I was proud of her for being honest with herself. I said that was the hardest thing, and she'd done it. We talked for 2 hours. About her father, about the house, about the oak tree, about who she'd been as a child and who she'd allowed herself to become, and who she still had time to be. I told her about my friend's spare room, and the light that came through the curtains in the afternoon, and the way I'd started sleeping through the night again for the first time in years. She said, I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry I didn't protect you. I said, you didn't know how to. Nobody taught us. That's what we fix now. A few months passed, and then a few more. I found a small condo in a development a dozen miles from where I'd spent 26 years. 1 level. Good light. A small patio where I put a ceramic bird feeder. A new one. Not chipped. Which felt both like a betrayal and like permission. I let it feel like both. I was learning to make room for things to be complicated. My daughter and I talked every Sunday. She had moved into an apartment with a friend from work, started therapy, started running again the way she used to in college. She sounded different. Clearer, like someone whose voice had been competing with another sound for a long time, and now the other sound was gone. I joined a group at the community center for women over 60, not a grief group, exactly, more of an everything group. Women who were navigating the particular strange terrain of this age. Grown children who'd disappointed them. Husbands they'd lost. Versions of themselves they'd set aside for decades that they were now picking back up and examining in better light. We met on Thursday evenings, and sometimes we said very little, and sometimes we talked for 3 hours and the facilitator had to gently close the session. I started writing. I don't know what to call it. Not a memoir, exactly. Notes? Maybe. About the house? About my husband? About what it meant to spend 30 years building something and what it meant to walk away from it. About what I lost and what I found in the space left behind. One Thursday evening, a woman in the group who had been mostly quiet for 2 months said, I keep thinking I should have fought harder. I keep wondering if leaving was giving up. I thought about that for a moment. About the note I'd left on the kitchen counter. About the letter I'd mailed from the post office. About my daughter's voice saying I left him. About the way I'd walked through every room that last night, not fighting and not surrendering, just saying a proper goodbye to a version of my life so I could begin the next one. I said, there are different kinds of fighting. Some of them look like staying. Some of them look like leaving. The one that doesn't count is the one where you stay past the point of return and let something slowly take everything you are until there's nothing left worth fighting for. That one doesn't look like love. It just looks like it on the surface. She thought about that. Then she nodded like a woman, adding something to a list she'd been working on for years. I thought about my daughter, who was running again on Sunday mornings before she called me, who had started taking a ceramics class on Wednesdays, who laughed now on the phone, with a laugh that sounded like the one I remembered from before she was married. I thought about my husband and his oak trees and his deliberate thinking. He used to say that the best choices don't always look obvious at the time. They look obvious later, when you're far enough away to see what shape they made. I planted a small rose bush on my patio in the fall, not because I'd always wanted one, but because I had the space now, and no one would paint over it or redirect the water bill or call it ours without meaning me. It was mine, that small, uncomplicated, irreducibly mine. There was a morning in November. Early. Cold. The sky still more gray than blue. When I sat on my patio with coffee and a blanket, and watched the rose bush holding the frost on its bare canes, and thought, I am not afraid of winter anymore. Not this one. Not the ones after. The house sold to a young couple. I heard this from my realtor in a brief follow-up message she sent when the closing was final. She said they'd asked about the oak tree in the backyard, whether it was healthy, how old. She told them it had been planted decades ago by the original owner, a man who believed in planting things he wouldn't fully see in his lifetime. They decided to keep it. I read that part of her message twice. Then I put the phone down and looked out at my rose bush and felt something settle in my chest that didn't have a clean name but didn't need one. My daughter called that Sunday. Same as always. She said she'd driven past the old neighborhood on her way to a friend's house and slowed down out of habit. She said the door had been painted a different color and there were bikes on the porch, and it looked like a different place entirely, which she had expected, but which still landed somewhere tender in her. She said, Is it strange that I miss it? I said, No, it would be stranger if you didn't. She said, Do you miss it? I looked around my small living room. At the photographs I'd rehung on different walls. At my husband's armchair that I'd had reupholstered in the same fabric because I couldn't change it completely and didn't want to. At the bird feeder just visible through the patio door. I said, I miss some things about it. I don't miss who I was becoming inside it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I've been thinking about something you wrote in the letter, about how you kept measuring your worth by how much you could give, and how you didn't realize until too late that some people were measuring you the same way. I said, Yes. She said, I think I've been doing that too. Not with you. With myself. I said, I know. That's the part we're both working on. We stayed on the phone a little longer than usual that morning, not saying much, just keeping the line open the way you do with someone you love and don't want to hang up on. The light moved across my living room wall. The rose bush on the patio sat small and bare and quietly alive. Eventually, she had to go. I said I loved her. She said she loved me too, and that she'd call next Sunday. I said I'd answer. After we hung up, I sat for a while in the particular Sunday morning quiet of a life that had been reduced and rearranged and was now, slowly, becoming large again in a different direction. Not rebuilt, not restored. Something newer than that. Something that was only mine to name. Outside, the first birds of the morning found the feeder. Small, unremarkable birds, going about the business of being alive in an ordinary November. I watched them for a long time.